Dead Waters Speak by Clara Voss. Chapter 1. The Silence of the Creek. The town of Hollow Creek had always been a place suspended between memory and myth. When Claire Vance left it, she did so with a quiet farewell, no tears, no promises. It had been an easy escape from the suffocating weight of small-town life, and she never looked back. But now, 20 years later, the tug of the past had pulled her back, uninvited, like the restless wind that stirred the autumn leaves as her car crept slowly down the familiar, faded streets. She hadn't wanted to come back, not for a reunion, not for a funeral, not for anything, but her mother's letter had been enough to stir something deep within her. "Come home, Claire. There's something here for you." The words, penned in a trembling hand, had haunted her for weeks before she finally succumbed. The house still stood at the end of Laurel Street, just as she remembered, though now the paint had begun to peel from the wooden slats, and the once vibrant garden was choked with overgrown weeds. Her footsteps creaked on the porch as she approached the door, the faint smell of dust and pine needles clinging to the air. The silence was thick, heavy with something unspoken, and for a moment she thought she heard whispers, barely audible, but present nonetheless. It made her pause. "Home," she whispered to herself, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Her mother, the only one left of the Vance family, sat in her favorite chair by the window, staring out at the barren creek behind the house. Her eyes were distant, almost lost. Claire cleared her throat, but the sound barely made a dent in the thick atmosphere. "Mom?" Claire asked softly, stepping closer. The older woman turned, her eyes filled with something that might have been sorrow or fear, or perhaps both. "You're here," she said, her voice hoarse, as if the words had been trapped in her throat for years. "I got your letter. What's going on? What's happened to the creek?" Her mother's gaze flickered toward the window again, but she didn't speak immediately. There was a long, uncomfortable pause before she murmured, "It's gone, Claire. The water. It's dry." Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" "It was never dry. It was always flowing, clear as crystal, even in winter." The old woman nodded slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "I know. It was the heartbeat of this place." But now, she trailed off, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now it's a graveyard, and the dead are speaking." Claire's chest tightened. She'd heard the rumors, of course, the strange happenings, the unexplained noises in the night, the cryptic warnings from the townsfolk who had never left. But it all felt so far removed from the life she had made for herself in the city, away from the shadows of Hollow Creek. "Mom, you're not making sense," Claire said, kneeling beside her. "Tell me what happened. Why is the creek dry?" Her mother's eyes filled with something dark, something ancient. "Because they want to be heard. The dead. They've always been here, Claire. They've always been waiting." Claire recoiled slightly, a chill crawling up her spine. She had heard the stories about the drownings, the disappearances, the strange voices that drifted through the trees at night. But she never imagined her mother, of all people, would talk of them so openly. "Who wants to be heard?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother didn't answer right away. She just stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the creek bed, where the once glistening water had receded, leaving behind cracked earth and dried weeds. The sound of rustling leaves was all that filled the space between them now. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice distant. "The creek was never just a creek, Claire. It was a channel, a boundary. And when it dried up, it opened something we shouldn't have known about. The dead, they've crossed over. They're speaking now." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. Speaking how? Her mother turned slowly, her expression grave. "In dreams." in whispers. And sometimes, if you listen close enough, you can hear them right here. She placed a trembling hand over her chest. They call to you, Claire. They call to us all. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, thick with something Claire couldn't name, something malevolent. Her heart began to race. She had to know what her mother meant, what had happened to the town she had once left behind so easily. I'm going to the creek, Claire said, rising to her feet. I'll see it for myself. Her mother's eyes widened. Don't. You can't. But Claire was already walking toward the door. The cool breeze hit her face as she stepped outside, the leaves swirling in the distance, the sky above growing dimmer with the setting sun. She reached the end of the yard where the creek once ran like a vein of life through the heart of Hollow Creek. But now it was nothing but dry, cracked earth. The air smelled faintly of decay, of forgotten things. As Claire stood at the edge, her gaze falling on the dead water, a strange sensation crept over her, something familiar, yet unnervingly foreign. The silence was thick, heavy. And then, just as the first chill of night began to settle over the town, a soft whisper broke the stillness. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Claire's breath caught in her throat. And then, in the distance, the whisper turned into a word, a name. Her name, Claire. The voice was faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was calling to her from the dead waters, and they weren't going to stop until she listened. Chapter 2: The Echoes in the Wind. Claire's footsteps faltered as the whisper echoed through the air. The sound was so faint, so fragile, like the last vestiges of a forgotten dream. Yet it was undeniable. There in the air was a presence. It was a voice, her name, spoken softly, but with such clarity that it caused her chest to tighten with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Claire. The words seemed to linger, hanging in the autumn air like a dark thread connecting her to something long buried. Her eyes darted across the dry creek bed, but there was nothing to see. The earth was cracked, as though the land itself had been parched for centuries, and the faint remnants of weeds clung desperately to the ground. The water, once so clear, so vibrant, was now an absent memory, leaving nothing but emptiness. Who's there? Claire called out, her voice trembling against the oppressive quiet. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her pulse quickening. But there was no answer, only the soft rustling of dead leaves carried on the wind. For a long moment she stood there, her gaze fixed on the dried creek, waiting for any sign, any sound. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The town felt suffocatingly still, as though the very air held its breath, anticipating something. But nothing came, not a sound, not a movement. Reluctantly, Claire turned away from the creek and made her way back toward the house. The chill of the evening crept into her bones, seeping beneath her jacket, but it wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the unshakable feeling that something, someone, was watching her. The air seemed to grow heavier with every step she took, the silence pressing against her like an unseen force. When she returned to the house, her mother was sitting exactly where Claire had left her, staring out the window with that same distant, haunted expression. It was as if nothing had changed, as if no time had passed. Claire's mind raced, but she kept her voice steady as she approached her. Mom, did you hear that? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's gaze flickered toward her, but there was no recognition in her eyes, only a deep, unsettling sadness. I heard it, she said softly. It's always been there. The dead, Claire. They've been calling to us for years. But now they found a way to make themselves known, to be heard. Claire swallowed hard. She wanted to question her mother further, to demand answers, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she couldn't find the words. What could she say? How could she explain the chill that had settled into her bones, the sensation that the land itself was alive, waiting, watching, listening? Why? Claire asked, her voice strained. Why now? Why have they started speaking? Her mother's eyes glistened, her expression haunted. Because the creek, the waters were the only thing that kept them in the dark. The water kept them trapped, held back from crossing over. But now she paused, and Claire saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. Now the boundary has broken. The water is gone, and with it, the veil between the living and the dead. A shiver ran down Claire's spine. The reality of her mother's words settled in, sinking deep into her mind. This wasn't just some idle superstition. It was something darker, something real. She had known Hollow Creek was a strange place, full of whispered tales and eerie legends, but she had never imagined it could be this, alive. What do we do? Claire asked, her voice hoarse. How do we stop them? Her mother turned to face her fully now, her eyes filled with the weight of years of hidden fear. We can't stop them, Claire. The dead are already here. They're in the land, in the wind, in the air we breathe. They're calling, trying to cross over to our world. Claire shook her head. But we can stop this, can't we? There has to be a way. This can't just be happening. Her mother's face twisted in sorrow, and she slowly shook her head. You can't fight the past, Claire. The dead, they don't want to be stopped. They only want to be heard. Claire's mind reeled, her thoughts swirling in a dizzying spiral. She had to know more. She couldn't just stand by and let the shadows consume everything. There had to be a way to break this, to understand it. She had to find the truth. I'm going back to the creek, Claire said suddenly, her voice firm. She turned toward the door, but before she could take a step, her mother's frail hand gripped her arm. Don't, her mother pleaded, her voice shaking. Please, don't go back there. The creek is a place of no return now. Claire met her mother's gaze, her jaw set with determination. I have to. I have to understand what's happening. I can't just ignore this. Her mother looked at her as though she were seeing her for the first time, the lines of age and worry deepening on her face. Then take care, Claire. The dead, they don't forget, and they don't forgive. The words hung heavy in the air, but Claire didn't let them deter her. She needed answers, and she would find them. The walk to the creek felt different this time. The wind had picked up, the branches above creaking and groaning like the voices of the lost. Claire's breath seemed to come easier as she moved through the cool night air, but there was something suffocating about the quiet. The world seemed to close in around her, and with every step, the sense that something, someone, was watching her grew stronger. When she reached the creek, the sight before her made her stomach tighten. It was just as it had been before, dry, barren, dead. But now there was something else. The earth seemed to pulse, as though it were alive beneath her feet. The air hung thick with an unseen presence. It was as if the land itself were holding its breath. Suddenly there was a sound, a soft rustling. Claire's head snapped around, but she saw nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the sound of leaves brushing against each other like a whisper in the dark. But then the whispering grew louder. Claire. The voice was clearer this time, more urgent, more insistent. It was coming from the creek. She hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, drawn to the edge of the dry creek bed. As she knelt down, she could hear it more distinctly, the sound of something stirring in the earth, in the roots, in the very bones of the land. It was a whisper, like a promise. Listen. And Claire listened. Chapter 3, Beneath the Surface. The moon hung high in the sky, its silver light filtering through the skeletal branches of the trees above Claire. The creek lay before her, dry and lifeless, yet it hummed with an energy she couldn't ignore. It was a sensation deep in her chest, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Beneath her, beneath the cracked soil, dead roots, something was stirring. Something old. The whisper that had beckoned her earlier still lingered in the air, faint but undeniable. It was a voice that called her by name, as though it had been waiting for her, watching her since she had left this place all those years ago. The voice was soft, like a breath, but its urgency had grown. Listen. Claire's heart quickened. She hadn't imagined it. She couldn't have. She had heard the voice. It was as real as the cool night air, as real as the earth beneath her hands. Slowly, cautiously, she knelt closer to the creek bed, her fingertips brushing the dry dirt. Claire! The voice was clearer now, sharp, almost desperate, and it wasn't just calling her name. There was something else, something hidden beneath the whisper. A message faint and fractured, as though it had been trapped for too long. Who are you? She whispered into the silence, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if she was asking the voice or if she was asking herself, but the question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Suddenly, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble. It was subtle at first, just a slight quiver, a ripple that made her wonder if she had imagined it. But then it happened again, more forcefully, and the dry earth around her cracked, as if something had shifted below. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she backed away instinctively, her body tense with fear and curiosity. The ground in front of her shifted, a low groan rising from the depths of the earth. Claire's pulse raced. She could feel it now, unmistakable, a presence, dark and ancient, pulling at the very fabric of reality. The whisper grew louder. We are here. Claire stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had come back to Hollow Creek seeking answers, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The voice wasn't just a memory or a ghost. It was something alive, something that had been waiting for her. And the creek, the dry, barren creek, was its gateway. Claire's hand trembled as she reached down, her fingers brushing the cracked earth. She felt it, something cold, something slick beneath the dirt. It was as though the soil had been disturbed, revealing a hidden layer of something older, something that didn't belong to this world. Suddenly, she pulled her hand away with a sharp intake of breath. Something had touched her. A finger, cold as death, had brushed against her skin. And for a fleeting moment, she saw it, just a flicker, a shape, rising from the ground beneath her, emerging from the darkness of the creek. It was a figure, a silhouette, standing in the dry bed of the creek, its form barely discernible in the moonlight. Its features were blurred, undefined, but Claire could feel its presence, its weight pressing down on the air around her. You must listen. The voice was stronger now, more insistent. And then, as though the figure was reaching out, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that made Claire's blood run cold. It was a voice, not a whisper now, but a chorus, rising from the depths of the earth. The water is gone, but the voices remain. They have always been here, waiting. The figure seemed to shimmer, its edges blurring in the moonlight, and Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward. Her legs shook beneath her, but she couldn't look away. The presence was all around her now, heavy and suffocating. Who are you? She breathed. her voice breaking with the weight of fear and disbelief. "What do you want?" The figure did not answer with words. Instead, it moved, the shadows swirling around it as if it were made of darkness itself. It reached out, its form elongating, stretching, and for a moment Claire felt the earth beneath her feet shift once again. The dry creek bed seemed to crack, as if it were coming alive, reaching up to swallow her whole. The water was our voice. The whisper echoed, distant, but the meaning was clear. "Now, we speak through you." A jolt of panic gripped Claire's chest, and she stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her throat. "No, no, I can't." Her words were choked off by a sudden pressure in her chest, as if something had wrapped itself around her heart. The figure moved closer, and Claire felt the cold rush of air around her, the suffocating weight of its presence pressing in. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world seemed to close in around her, the shadows twisting, the air thickening with an unspoken threat. "You are the one who must listen," the voice continued, now layered with dozens of others, their tones haunting and mournful. "You are the one who must hear the truth." Claire's eyes widened in terror. "What truth?" she gasped. "What are you talking about?" The figure seemed to pause, as if considering her question. The air grew still, the wind halting as if time itself had frozen. And then, slowly, the figure reached out, extending a dark, elongated hand toward her. "The truth of the dead. The truth of the creek. The truth of Hollow Creek." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet shifted once more, the earth groaning as though it were alive. Claire fell to her knees, the weight of the presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She gasped for breath, her chest heaving, but no air seemed to reach her lungs. "Listen, Claire." The whispers were louder now, rising from every direction, from beneath the earth, from the trees, from the very wind itself. Claire's vision blurred as the weight of their words sank into her mind, their meaning creeping into her thoughts like a poison. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The figure was gone. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence of the night in their wake. Claire remained kneeling in the dry creek bed, trembling, her body cold with sweat. Her heart still raced, but the sense of presence was gone. The air felt still, lifeless. But the words lingered. The truth of the dead. The truth of the creek. The truth of Hollow Creek. Claire's head swam with the weight of those words. What did they mean? What had she just experienced? The world felt like it was shifting beneath her, and for the first time in years she felt a deep, growing certainty. She had come back to Hollow Creek seeking answers, but what she had uncovered was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Ones. The dawn broke slowly over Hollow Creek, its pale light creeping through the trees and filtering across the empty creek bed. Claire sat by the edge of the waterless stream, her body still trembling from the night's events. Her mind, however, was far from calm. She hadn't slept, hadn't dared to close her eyes for fear the shadows might return, the voice might call her again, the thing beneath the earth might rise. But as the morning light bathed the town in quiet warmth, a strange sense of emptiness washed over her. The world around her was still. The trees stood unmoving. The wind whispered in the distance, and the old houses of Hollow Creek, long abandoned by most, loomed in the distance like forgotten sentinels. Her fingers brushed the cracked soil beneath her, and she was met with an unsettling sense of stillness. The earth felt cold beneath her touch, as though it were holding its breath, waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know, but she felt certain it had to do with the creek, the lifeless bed, the empty, cracked earth where water once ran freely. Claire stood, her legs shaking as she made her way back toward the old house. Her mind was reeling, and the only thought that clung to her, like a shadow, was the same message she had heard repeated in the darkness. The truth of the dead, the truth of the creek, the truth of Hollow Creek. The words echoed in her mind as she walked the familiar path back to the house she had left years ago. It had always been a place of quiet disarray, abandoned after her mother's death, and Claire had never thought to return. But now, everything felt different, as though the place too had been waiting for her. As she reached the front door, the old wood creaked beneath her touch. She paused, hand still on the knob, and a shiver ran through her. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something else, a deep sense of inevitability. She stepped inside, the house feeling colder than it had when she left it. Dust hung in the air like a fog, settling over everything in thick layers. The silence was oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Claire moved through the room slowly, taking in the faded wallpaper, the broken furniture, the creaking floorboards. There was a sense of abandonment, yes, but also something deeper, something heavier. The house felt as though it had been untouched for much longer than she had imagined. It was as though time had folded in on itself here, as if this place existed outside the passage of years. She made her way to the back of the house, where her mother's old study was. The room had been her mother's sanctuary, the place where she would sit for hours, writing in journals or reading her strange, cryptic books. Claire had never fully understood her mother's obsession with Hollow Creek, with the history of the land, the old tales of the dead, and the forgotten. As Claire opened the door to the study, she was met with the unmistakable scent of old paper, the musty aroma of books long untouched. The desk where her mother had once worked sat in the corner, its surface cluttered with papers and books, some of which had long since faded into obscurity. But it was the journal on the desk that caught Claire's attention. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Her mother's handwriting was etched onto the first page, the ink faded, but still legible. The creek has a voice, and it calls to those who listen. The water is the passage, but the dead are its keepers. It speaks to those it chooses, to those who are meant to hear. Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, scanning her mother's words. They were fragmented, disjointed, ramblings, really about spirits, voices in the water, and the old ones that lingered in the shadows. But one thing was clear. Her mother had known. She had known something dark, something hidden in the depths of Hollow Creek, and it was something Claire had never understood until now. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Claire's heart jolted in her chest, and she quickly closed the journal, shoving it into a drawer. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an overwhelming need to hide it, to protect it from whatever, whoever, might come through that door. When she opened it, she was met by the familiar face of Sheriff Daniels. His expression was grim, his brow furrowed with concern. "Claire," he said softly, his voice low, "we need to talk." Claire stepped back, allowing him inside. She could see the worry in his eyes, the lines of age and hardship etched into his face. He wasn't the same young man who had once been her childhood friend. He had changed, as had the town, as had everything. She could see the weight of the years pressing on him now. "What's going on, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her insides. "I've been hearing things, Claire," he said, glancing around as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Strange things. People are talking about the creek, and they're scared." Claire's heart sank. She had already felt it, the unease in the air, the way the town seemed to shudder at the mention of the creek, but she hadn't known how deep the fear ran. "People are saying they're hearing voices, Claire," Sheriff Daniels continued, his gaze meeting hers. voices from the creek. They're calling to them, and they're not just passing whispers. People say they've seen things, figures rising from the dry creek bed, shadows that don't belong. There's talk of the dead. Claire's stomach tightened. The whispers, the voices. She had heard them too, and now it seemed the town was starting to sense what she had already felt. The air around Hollow Creek was thick with something unspoken, something ancient, and something that could no longer be ignored. I heard it too, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Last night. I, I think I know what's happening. Sheriff Daniels' eyes narrowed, his expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and concern. You know, I'm not sure what it means yet, but I think the dead are speaking through the creek, she said, her voice shaking with the weight of her words. They've always been here, Sheriff. They're tied to this place. Sheriff Daniels took a step back, his expression faltering. You're not the first person to say something like that, and you won't be the last, I fear. There's something in the air, Claire. Something's waking up, something that's been buried for a long time. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Something buried, something old. Claire felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, and for the first time she wondered if coming back to Hollow Creek was a mistake. But deep down she knew she had no choice. The creek, the voices, the truth, it was all calling to her, and there was no turning back. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. Claire stood at the edge of the creek, watching the empty bed stretch out before her like a dry, cracked wound in the earth. The morning sun hung in the sky, casting its golden light over the barren landscape, but it felt too bright, too hot for the coldness that had settled in her chest. The land seemed to shimmer under the weight of something unseen, as if the very earth was waiting for something to rise from beneath it. It had been 3 days since Sheriff Daniels had come to her with his concerns, and in those 3 days the unease that had clung to Hollow Creek had only grown. People were avoiding the creek, no longer walking its banks or gathering for picnics as they had in the past. The sound of the town had dulled, muffled by the fear that seemed to seep into every corner of the place. Claire's feet itched to leave, to run from the strange, oppressive atmosphere that hung in the air. But something she couldn't explain, kept her rooted to the spot. The creek had been calling to her, even when she had tried to ignore it. She couldn't fight it anymore. She had to understand what was happening, even if it meant unraveling the darkest parts of Hollow Creek's history, even if it meant confronting the ghosts of her past. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the dry earth. It felt strange, colder than it should have been, as though the land had been stripped of its warmth. Her mother's journal echoed in her mind, "The creek has a voice, and it calls to those who listen." Claire shuddered, but she couldn't stop the pull, the insistent tug of the past that seemed to be guiding her forward. Behind her, the old house loomed like a silent witness to everything that had happened in Hollow Creek. It was strange how much it had changed in the short time since her return. The house felt more like a memory than a place, its walls echoing with the sounds of footsteps long since faded, the air thick with the weight of secrets buried deep within it. Secrets that Claire wasn't sure she was ready to face. She stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and turned to leave the creek bed, but something caught her eye. There in the distance, just beyond the dry bed, a shadow moved, a shape that shouldn't have been there. For a brief moment, it was just a trick of the light, or so she thought. But as the shadow flickered again, she knew it wasn't. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she walked toward the figure. It was barely visible, a fleeting presence that disappeared each time she blinked. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary shadow. She called out, her voice shaking. "Hello? Is someone there?" The shadow stopped, For a long, drawn-out moment, it lingered in the distance, unmoving, as if weighing her words. Then, as if it had never been there at all, it vanished. Claire's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if what she had seen was real or some trick of her mind, but the sense of dread was unmistakable. The voice from the other night, the one that had whispered her name, calling to her from the creek, began to rise in her mind again. The dead are watching. The dead are waiting. A rustling behind her made Claire turn sharply. Sheriff Daniels stood a few feet away, his face drawn with concern, his eyes scanning the area nervously. He had clearly been watching her for some time. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice low. Claire nodded, her throat tight. A shadow. It moved like it was trying to speak to me. The sheriff's gaze darkened. It's not just your mind playing tricks. People are talking about things they've seen by the creek. Figures that shouldn't be there. Faces in the water. And the voices have gotten louder. Claire swallowed hard. What do you think it means? What's happening to the creek? I don't know, Daniel said, shaking his head. But whatever it is, it's not natural. This town, it's always had its share of strange stories, but this feels different. Claire glanced back at the creek, her eyes tracing the jagged, empty path where water should have been flowing. My mother, she began hesitantly. She wrote about this in her journal. She said the creek was a passage, that the dead spoke through it. Sheriff Daniels' eyes narrowed. Huh, your mother believed that? Yes. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. She believed the creek had a connection to the dead. She thought it was a portal, a place where the past and the present could meet. Sheriff Daniels stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low. I've been here my whole life, Claire. I've heard all the stories, the rumors, but I never thought there was any truth to them. Now I'm not so sure. I think it's happening, Claire said, her voice trembling. I think the dead are trying to come through. And if we don't figure out why, if we don't stop it, I'm afraid they'll take more than just our memories. Daniel studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. What do you need? Claire took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I need to know what happened to the creek. I need to know what my mother found. She was close to something, Sheriff. Something important. The sheriff looked out toward the creek, then back to Claire. I'll help you. Whatever it takes. As they turned and walked toward the old house together, Claire felt the weight of the past pressing on her. The house seemed to loom larger with every step, its presence heavy with the knowledge of things that had been hidden. She had returned to Hollow Creek not just to confront the spirits of the past, but to uncover the truth of what lay beneath the surface, buried beneath the dry bed of the creek. And as they reached the door to the house, Claire knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that whatever her mother had discovered, whatever the creek had become, it was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 6: The Forgotten Ones. The air in the old house was thick with dust, the walls heavy with the silence that had settled over them for years. Claire and Sheriff Daniels entered the dimly lit living room, the creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet breaking the stillness like an uninvited guest. Claire's eyes scanned the familiar surroundings. Things hadn't changed much since her childhood. The same worn furniture, the same curtains that had once fluttered in the breeze. Yet the house felt different now. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before, as though something was stirring just beneath the surface. This is where she used to spend most of her time, Claire said, her voice softer now. She ran a hand along the back of the old sofa, feeling the familiar fabric under her fingers. My mother, she was always here, working, writing. Sheriff Daniels looked around, his eyes sharp as ever. You said she wrote about the creek. Where exactly would she have kept her notes? Claire motioned to the small desk in the corner of the room, piled high with papers, books, and faded photographs. She had a study in here where she kept everything. Her journals, the research she'd been doing. She'd been trying to piece things together. I think she was getting close to something. Her voice trailed off, her mind racing with the possibilities of what her mother might have uncovered. Daniel stepped forward, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the desk. He began sifting through the papers, flipping through pages with practiced hands. Claire stood behind him, watching, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She had spent so many years trying to move past this town, trying to forget the strange, unsettling events that had plagued her childhood. But now, with the creek silent and the voices growing louder, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know the truth. Minutes passed in silence as Daniel skimmed through the papers. Then he stopped suddenly, his finger resting on a page that had been folded carefully at the corner. "This one," he said, his voice low. "This looks like it's from your mother." Claire leaned over his shoulder, reading the familiar handwriting that filled the page. Her heart raced as she began to make out the words. "The creek has stopped, and with it, the voices have gone silent. But the silence is not peace. It is the calm before the storm. I can feel them, the ones who have not crossed over, reaching out through the dry bed, trying to make themselves known." Claire's stomach turned as she read the next part. "There is something buried beneath the creek, something ancient. It is not a blessing, as the town believes, but a curse. A curse that binds the living to the dead. And the time has come for the dead to reclaim what is theirs." Claire looked up at Sheriff Daniels, her mind racing. What does this mean? What curse? What is buried beneath the creek? Daniels set the paper down gently, his expression unreadable. "It sounds like your mother was onto something much bigger than she realized. If the creek was truly a portal, if it was meant to connect the living to the dead, there's no telling what might have been buried there over the years, or what kind of darkness it could have unleashed." Claire felt a chill seep into her bones, her thoughts turning over in her mind. Could the dead, could they have been sealed away somehow, trapped beneath the creek? Daniels nodded slowly. "It's possible. Whatever this is, whatever your mother found, it seems to tie everything back to that creek. The dry bed, the voices, the shadow you saw, the dead are trying to cross over, and they're using the creek as their path." Claire clenched her fists. But why now? Why would they start speaking after all these years? "Maybe they were waiting," Daniel said quietly. "Waiting for the right time. Or maybe something triggered it. Something that broke the barrier." Claire turned away, her mind spinning. She didn't know what to think anymore. Her mother had known something, but she had never fully understood it. And now Claire was faced with the possibility that the answers lay hidden beneath the creek itself. "I have to go back to the creek," Claire said suddenly, the determination in her voice catching Daniels off guard. "I have to find out what's really down there." The sheriff stood up, his hand resting on the desk. "Claire, we don't know what's waiting for you down there. This isn't something we can take lightly. The town is on edge. People are talking about strange things happening. It's not safe." "I don't care about the danger," Claire snapped, her voice sharp with urgency. "This is my family's history, my mother's research. I need to know what happened to her. I need to know what the creek has been hiding all these years." Daniels hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "I'll come with you," he said. "But you have to promise me something. Promise me that you won't do anything reckless. If there's something out there, we need to face it together. No more running head first into things." Claire met his gaze, her mind made up. "I promise. But we're going to the creek. We're going to find the truth." The sheriff gave a reluctant nod. Let's go then. The drive back to the creek was silent, the tension between them thick and heavy. Claire's thoughts swirled with questions she couldn't answer. What had her mother uncovered? What had she been so afraid of? And what did the creek truly hold beneath its dry surface? As they neared the edge of town, the familiar sight of the creek appeared in the distance. But it looked different now. The dry, cracked earth seemed to stretch endlessly before them, an empty wound in the landscape. The trees along the banks stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches reaching up to the sky as though trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. When they arrived, Claire was the first to step out of the car. She felt the cool breeze on her skin, but it did nothing to calm the tightening in her chest. She looked out over the barren creek bed, her heart pounding in her ears. This is it, she whispered, more to herself than to Daniels. Sheriff Daniels stood beside her, his eyes scanning the area with a mixture of caution and disbelief. It's strange, he muttered. There's nothing here, no signs of life. Claire's gaze narrowed. It's not about what's here. It's about what's buried beneath, and I think we're about to find out what that is. With that, they walked toward the dry creek bed, the earth beneath their feet giving off a quiet, almost mournful sound with every step they took. And as they moved deeper into the heart of the creek, Claire felt it, the sensation that they were not alone. Something was watching them. Something old, something that had been waiting. And it was about to speak. Chapter 7. The Echoes Below. The wind had picked up as they stood at the edge of the dry creek bed, its cold fingers brushing past them like a whispered warning. The familiar hum of the world had gone still. The birds were quiet, the trees barely moved, and the sky seemed to hang low, heavy with the promise of a storm that had yet to come. The silence felt suffocating, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Claire could feel it, the weight of something ancient pressing down on her chest. The air was thick with secrets, and she knew without a doubt that she had come to the place where the truth was buried, the place where her mother had once stood, searching for answers that now seemed so close she could almost taste them. This is where it all ends, she whispered, more to herself than to Sheriff Daniels, who stood just a few paces behind her. His eyes were scanning the creek bed, his hand resting on his holster, but Claire knew that even he could sense the gravity of the moment. Daniel spoke, his voice low and hesitant. It's nothing but dust and bones out here. There's nothing to find. But Claire shook her head, her gaze fixed on the cracked earth beneath her feet. It's not nothing. There's something here. I know it. The sheriff hesitated, then sighed. All right. What do you want to do? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crouched down by the edge of the creek bed, running her fingers over the dry, brittle soil. The earth felt wrong, as though it had been untouched for far too long. Claire's mind raced back to the words from her mother's journal. The dead were reaching out, trying to cross over. And then it hit her. She stood up abruptly. There's no water, but there's still a current, she muttered, half to herself. Not a physical one, in energy. Something is still flowing beneath us. Daniels looked at her with skepticism, but Claire could see the shift in his eyes. He had been here long enough to know that strange things happened in these woods, things that couldn't be explained. And whatever it was she was sensing, he could feel it too. Maybe we should start digging, Claire said, a strange determination taking root in her chest. Daniels frowned. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Digging might be a bad idea. But Claire was already moving. She took off her jacket and set it down on the ground, kneeling at the creek bed and brushing away the dust and dirt. Her fingers trembled with anticipation as she dug deeper, her nails scraping against something hard beneath the earth. The sound of her movements seemed to amplify in the silence, each scrape of dirt against stone echoing like a heartbeat. The sheriff stood by, watching her with a mixture of concern and resignation. But even he couldn't deny the pull of the unknown, the way the land seemed to hum with a dark, ancient energy. "I'm not stopping," Claire said, her voice steady though her heart was pounding. "This is the only way." With renewed determination, she dug faster, her hands working in a frenzied motion. She could feel the earth giving way beneath her, the soil growing softer as her fingers brushed against something cold, something smooth. And then, with a final, desperate pull, Claire unearthed a small, weathered box, its edges worn and chipped, as though it had been buried for centuries. The box was made of dark wood, its surface etched with symbols Claire didn't recognize, ancient runes that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. She froze, staring at it. The air around them had shifted, a strange vibration coursing through the ground, vibrating through her bones. She could almost hear something beneath the earth, a low, guttural hum, as though the land itself was alive with whispers. Daniels knelt beside her, his expression darkening. "What in God's name is that?" Claire didn't answer at first. She felt it, an instinct deep inside her that told her the box held more than just secrets. It was a key, a doorway, something that had been hidden away for a reason. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed her fingers over the top of the box. The moment her skin made contact with the wood, a sharp jolt of energy shot through her, making her body tense. The hum grew louder, rising from the earth like a chorus of voices, distant but growing nearer. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sheriff grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Claire, get away from it." But Claire couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the box, her hands still resting on it. She could feel something, something ancient and terrible, pulsing within it, a presence that had been waiting for years to be released. The voices grew louder, clearer now, murmuring in a language she couldn't understand, but the meaning was undeniable. It was a call, a beckoning, a plea. And then the ground beneath them trembled. Claire's eyes widened in shock. "We need to open it. Now." "No," Daniel's voice was firm, his grip tightening on her arm. "You don't know what's inside, Claire. We can't risk it." But it was too late. Something had already been awakened. The tremors beneath their feet intensified, the air thickening with an energy that felt electric, charged with malice. A low, anguished scream filled the air, so primal, so full of sorrow and rage, that it felt like the very soul of the earth was crying out. The ground cracked open beneath them, revealing a darkness that stretched deeper than the creek bed, deeper than the very earth itself. Claire stumbled back, her heart racing. The sheriff pulled her away, but she couldn't tear her eyes from the yawning chasm that had opened before them. From the depths of the darkness, a figure began to rise. Slowly at first, then faster, as though pulled upward by some unseen force. It was a man, no, a shape, a shadow of a man, his features distorted, his form twisted by the passage of time. And then, with a voice that rattled the very air, it spoke. "You should have stayed away." The words echoed in Claire's mind, sinking deep into her soul like a needle. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure's eyes locked onto her. And in that moment, she knew this was no ordinary ghost. It was something far darker, something ancient. And it had been waiting for her. Chapter 8: The Whispering Depths. The figure rose from the chasm, an abomination of shadow and form. its outline shifting as if it were not bound by the laws of time or space. Its eyes, two hollow, endless voids, burned into Claire, filling her with a suffocating dread. Her body froze, caught between the primal instinct to flee and an overpowering compulsion to remain rooted to the earth. Daniels, too, stood paralyzed, his hand still gripping Claire's arm, as though trying to anchor her to reality. His breath came in shallow bursts, his knuckles white with tension. "It's not real," he whispered, though his voice trembled, betraying his doubt. The creature's presence distorted the very air, bending light and sound. A deep, resonant hum emanated from the chasm, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet, reverberating into their very bones. It was a sound that didn't belong to this world, a sound that made the walls of the small, haunted town feel closer, more oppressive, like the walls of a tomb closing in. The figure spoke again, its voice a rasping echo, its words barely intelligible. But Claire understood them all the same. "You were foolish to return." Claire felt a jolt of icy terror shoot through her veins, her muscles screaming for release, but still she couldn't move. Her gaze never wavered from the figure that was slowly ascending from the dark depths of the earth, a presence that seemed to grow with every breath she took. "I didn't come for you," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, though she could feel her heart pounding in her throat. The words felt like a lie, but she had to say them. She had to convince herself she wasn't in the grip of something beyond comprehension. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it swayed, as though considering her words, before its form flickered like a dying flame and then solidified. It was taller now, its twisted limbs reaching outward, extending far beyond the limitations of what should have been possible. "Then why did you come, child?" The voice was low, mocking, yet threaded with something darker. "Did you think you could escape the past? That it would leave you be?" Claire's throat constricted. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, memories of the journals and the cryptic warnings. The dead had been trying to speak. But what were they trying to say? What had been buried here in this forsaken creek bed, and what did it have to do with her? Daniel, snapping out of his paralysis, stepped forward, his hand reaching for his gun. "Stay back," he ordered, but Claire could see the tremor in his hand. Even he, hardened by years of law enforcement, was not immune to the overwhelming fear that flooded the air. "No," Claire shouted, gripping his wrist. "Don't shoot. You'll only make it worse." But the sheriff hesitated. His gaze flickered between the figure and Claire, confusion and fear swirling in his eyes. "What the hell is that thing, Claire?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's tied to the creek, to the land, to everything I've been running from." The figure's form seemed to pulse, shifting again as it loomed closer. It was almost too real now, the lines of its body sharpening, the hollow eyes narrowing as though it were studying them, watching them, with an intelligence that was both ancient and terrifying. "It has come," at rest, "because you chose to awaken what was buried. You cannot undo it now." The ground beneath them rumbled again, and Claire felt the air grow colder. The whispers of the past, voices, memories, echoes of long-forgotten lives, seemed to stir in the wind, rising like the distant murmur of a river that had once flowed freely, only to be choked by the weight of time. "We have been waiting," the figure continued, its voice now louder, more insistent. "The waters have spoken, and they will not be silenced again. You are the key, the end and the beginning." Claire's mind raced. The key. She remembered the journal, her mother's desperate scribblings about an ancient power, an old curse tied to the land, and a force that had once been sealed away. But what did it all mean? What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice trembling despite herself. The figure's grin, or what might have been a grin, widened, its mouth stretching unnaturally. We want the truth, and we want you to see it. Suddenly, the air crackled with a sharp, electric pulse, and Claire felt herself being drawn toward the chasm, her body no longer her own. The earth seemed to groan beneath her feet, the ground shifting as if the very bones of the town were rising, reaching out to claim her. Claire, no! Daniel shouted, grabbing her just as she stumbled forward. He pulled her back, his grip tight and urgent. You can't go near it. It's pulling you in. But the force was too strong. It had already claimed her, the whispers of the dead seeping into her mind, filling her thoughts with 1,000 fragmented memories, voices from the past, all speaking at once. They spoke of death, of betrayal, of things that should never have been uncovered. Help me! Claire gasped, her body trembling, her knees buckling under the weight of what she was seeing. Images of the past flashed before her eyes. Her mother, her childhood, a story she had never truly understood. She saw a woman, much like herself, standing by the creek, staring down at the same dry bed, and then a figure standing beside her, a man, his face obscured, his voice lost to the winds. You cannot fight what is already inside you, the figure whispered, its voice now everywhere, wrapping around Claire like a cold shroud. You are the blood of this land. You are the one who will release us. Suddenly, there was a sharp, violent tug in Claire's chest, and with it came a vision, clear and vivid, a memory that didn't belong to her. She saw a woman standing beside the creek, watching as the waters ran dry. A dark, twisted figure emerged from the shadows, whispering promises of power, of knowledge, promises that had come with a terrible price. Claire gasped, breaking free of the vision as though emerging from a drowning nightmare. My mother, she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. She knew. Daniels looked at her, his expression filled with confusion and fear. What are you saying, Claire? What's happening? But Claire didn't have time to answer. The ground beneath them shifted again, and the figure spoke once more. The truth is here, Claire, and it will take everything. Chapter 9. Beneath the Silence. The air around them felt thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. Claire's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as the vision faded, but the terror it left in its wake clung to her like a second skin. The figure in front of her, this twisted being, loomed larger now, its form growing more defined with each passing second, as though it was fed by her fear, by her realization. You've seen it, the figure said, its voice low and resonating, like the hum of an ancient bell. You've touched the past. Claire stumbled backward, her feet skidding on the dry, cracked earth. The ground under her feet felt unstable, shifting with every step, as if it were alive and aware of her every move. The weight of the figure's presence pressed down on her, threatening to crush her with the gravity of its ancient power. Daniels was beside her, his hand on her arm, but even he seemed to shrink from the dark force before them. He, too, was a man undone, standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, the line between the present and the past growing thin and indistinct. All that mattered was the figure and the truth it was trying to extract. This is your heritage, the figure continued, its voice swirling with a malefic resonance. This is your inheritance, Claire. You cannot escape it. You are the blood that ties the living and the dead. I understand, Claire whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to steady herself. The world felt as though it was closing in, folding in on itself, and she struggled to hold on to some semblance of clarity. What do you want from me? The figure's gaze, those hollow, bottomless eyes, seemed to pierce through her, seeing past the present, into the very core of who she was. I do not want anything from you, it said, its tone almost affectionate, as if speaking to a wayward child. I need you to remember. Remember, she echoed, her pulse pounding in her ears. The words seemed to shudder in the air around her, an echo that carried more weight than any physical sound. What do you mean? The truth, the figure crooned, was buried long ago, when the creek still flowed and the town still whispered secrets among its roots. Your mother sought to bury it with the waters, but the truth cannot drown, Claire. It waits, and now it calls to you. Claire shook her head, fighting against the rising panic. The memories, fragments, began to churn in her mind. Pieces that had once been distant, disconnected. Her mother's cryptic words, the town's strange, unspoken history, the peculiar way things had felt, the heaviness in the air whenever she'd returned here. It was all beginning to connect, and the realization was more terrifying than the figure itself. I can't, Claire's voice faltered, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape, to find safety in anything other than this oppressive presence. But she knew deep down there was nowhere to run. The past was pulling her back, dragging her into the very place she had fled. The figure tilted its head, its form twisting with a mocking grace. You can run, Claire, but the truth will always find you. Daniels reached for her again, his grip tight, though he too looked as if he were losing his battle with fear. This isn't real, he muttered, more to himself than to her. This can't be real. It is real, Claire said, her voice raw. She looked at the figure once more, the dreadful knowledge settling in her bones. I think I know what it is now. The figure's grin spread wider. Do you? Then speak it. Say it aloud. Free yourself from the curse. Claire's chest tightened. The weight of the figure's words hung in the air, each syllable dragging her down into the depths of her own buried history. She remembered the stories her mother had never fully told her, the warnings left half-spoken, the shadow of something dark that loomed over her family's past. And now it was clear. The town had been built over something old, something cursed. The creek, the dry bed beneath her feet, was the seal, the boundary between the living and the dead. Her mother had known this, had tried to protect her from it, to bury it once and for all. But the land had refused to be forgotten. This is what my mother tried to stop, wasn't it? Claire asked, her voice shaky, but the truth now pressing its weight on her chest. The curse. The thing that was buried beneath the creek. The figure nodded, its motion unsettling, as if its very essence was like liquid darkness that didn't quite fit the form it occupied. Your mother's blood was strong. She fought it with all her might, but even she could not contain what is ancient and hungry. Claire felt the bile rise in her throat, the chilling realization settling like ice in her veins. It was never really gone, was it? You've been waiting all this time, waiting for me. The figure's laughter was soft, hollow, like the distant rustling of leaves in a long dead forest. You were always the key, Claire. Your bloodline is tied to this land, to this curse. You cannot undo what has already been set in motion. Daniels looked at Claire, his face etched with confusion and concern. Claire, what's happening? What is this thing? What does it want? But Claire only shook her head, her gaze lost in the shifting shadows of the figure's form. I can't stop it, she whispered, the truth feeling as though it was being carved into her soul. I wasn't meant to stop it. I'm just the one who has to let it out. The figure's grin widened, a grotesque thing, stretching impossibly wide. Exactly. You will release it. You will be the one to open the gate. The dead will speak, and the waters will flow once more. The ground trembled beneath them, and Claire stumbled backward, her vision blurring as the whispering grew louder, the voices from the past rising to a deafening crescendo. They called to her, begging, pleading, whispering secrets that had been buried for too long. The wind howled, and the figure's form began to dissipate, its presence fading into the air, leaving behind a chilling silence. But Claire knew it wasn't gone. It was never gone. It had only retreated, waiting for the moment when she would finally take the last step, when she would release the truth that had been buried beneath the silent waters. And the truth would consume them all. Chapter 10: The Return of the Waters. The silence that followed the figure's departure was deafening. Claire stood in the hollowed emptiness of the dry creek, the weight of her revelations pressing down on her chest. The land around her felt eerily still, like the calm before a storm. She could hear the faint whispering in her mind, the voices, growing louder now, filling every corner of her thoughts with their anguished pleas. They had been buried for so long, forgotten, but now they were awakening. Daniel stood beside her, his hand trembling as it clutched hers. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Claire, what did it mean?" he asked, his voice strained barely above a whisper. "What was that thing? What does it want from you?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted back to the empty creek bed, the dry earth where the water once flowed, where life had once thrived. Now it was only dust and silence, the earth cracked and hollowed out like an ancient wound that had never fully healed. It was as if the land itself was waiting for her to make the next move, to pull the final thread that would unravel it all. "The thing that came to me," Claire said, her voice hoarse, "it wasn't a creature. Not really. It was the land itself. The curse. The thing my mother tried to keep hidden. It's all tied together. It's tied to me." Her heart raced, the truth settling into her bones, becoming a part of her in a way that she couldn't deny, no matter how much she wanted to. The figure had been right. She was the key. Her bloodline had been intertwined with the land from the very beginning, and now it was time for her to do what had been inevitable. Daniels looked at her, his expression torn. "Claire, please, don't do this. There has to be another way." But Claire knew there wasn't. The land had been waiting for her, calling to her. The voices in her mind had grown stronger, more insistent, each whisper carrying a weight of guilt, of lost memories, of forgotten sins. She was their conduit, their vessel. The waters would return as they had before. The wind picked up, swirling dust around their feet, as if urging Claire to act. The land seemed to hum with a quiet, restless energy, ready for the release. Claire closed her eyes, taking in a deep, steadying breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "This is the only way," she whispered. Her voice cracked, the finality of her words settling like a stone in her chest. "I have to do this. I have to open the gate." Daniels tried to protest, but Claire turned toward the creek, her mind focused on the task at hand. She moved slowly, deliberately, stepping toward the center of the dry creek bed, the ground beneath her feet shifting with each step. She could feel the weight of her ancestors in the air, their presence heavy, suffocating, as if they were watching her, waiting for her to take this final step. As she reached the center of the creek, she knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cracked earth. A cold, electric sensation coursed through her fingertips, and she could hear the water, distant but growing nearer, calling to her, beckoning her to release it. She could feel the land trembling, as though it was coming alive, waiting for the waters to return. Claire closed her eyes and whispered the words that had been buried in her mind. Words she hadn't known she knew, words her mother had tried to keep from her. The incantation was ancient, buried deep within her blood, a part of her she couldn't escape. The air around her grew heavier, and the whispering grew louder until it was all she could hear. Voices rising from the earth, from the depths of the past, from the spirits who had been trapped for so long. With a final breath, Claire spoke the last word, and the earth shook beneath her. A deafening roar filled the air as the land began to crack, the dry creek bed splitting open like an old wound, releasing the water that had been buried for so long. The sound was overwhelming, the sound of the earth reclaiming what had once been lost. The water surged forth, rushing over the land with a fury that seemed to echo through time itself. As the waters rose, Claire felt a rush of energy, of power, of freedom. The spirits that had been trapped in the dry earth were finally released, their voices fading into the current of the water as it flowed once more. They were no longer trapped in the silence, no longer bound by the curse. They had returned, and with them the land was healed. But Claire knew that this wasn't the end. The curse had been lifted, but the land would never be the same. The waters would always return, and with them the echoes of the past. The ghosts would always haunt this place, lingering in the currents, in the whispers of the trees, in the stillness of the night. Daniel stood beside her, his face pale as he watched the water rise, the floodwaters swallowing the creek bed, flowing back into the land. He reached for her hand, and for a moment there was silence between them, a shared understanding of what had been done. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet. But there was a note of something deeper in it, a realization that this place, this town, could never truly be free. Not while the waters still ran. Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. She didn't speak, but inside she knew the truth. The waters had returned, and the dead had spoken. But they would never truly be silent again. The land was both cursed and blessed, bound by the ghosts of its past, forever intertwined with the blood of those who had walked here before. And Claire would always be a part of it.